Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. Today, we're doubling down on some of the themes in my previous episode and exploring further into the creeping power of unelected bureaucrats and how their entrenchment can imperil not just innovation, but democracy itself. From the historical roots in the administrative state to the modern struggle between blockchain pioneers and financial regulators, we'll examine how bureaucratic overreach, corruption, and collusion can trash the ideals our democratic institutions were created to uphold. And we'll explore how the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, in particular, a body ostensibly tasked with protecting investors and promoting fairness in financial markets, has instead in recent years become an emblem of obstruction, favoritism, and authoritarian inertia, especially when it comes to its treatment of emerging cryptocurrency platforms. Before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that it's been a while since I've released new content regularly, and I wasn't sure what to expect when I published my last episode. The warm response from longtime listeners was wonderful to see. Thank you. I'll try publishing shorter and more frequent episodes moving forward, so if you'd like to help me out, chip in a few bucks automatically whenever I publish, head to patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris. The link is in the show notes. Thanks again. Now let's get started. We often imagine corruption in government as something that comes from the top, from executive overreach, from cronyism in Congress, or from electoral meddling. But as every historian of state power eventually discovers, some of the most persistent and corrosive forms of political dysfunction emerge not from our elected officials, but from the unelected bureaucracies that outlast them. These bureaucracies tend to grow in complexity, shield themselves in language only experts understand, and justify their accumulation of power by citing the very chaos they help perpetuate. In the early 20th century, American political theorist James Burnham described this evolution in his landmark book, The Managerial Revolution. He argued that modern governments were becoming less democratic and more technocratic, governed not by elected representatives, but by professional managers and bureaucrats. These individuals were not directly accountable to the people. Instead, they administered, regulated, and interpreted the law, often behind closed doors and at a scale few citizens could understand, let alone control. Burnham was echoing the fears of earlier critics like Alexis de Tocqueville, who warned that democracy could give way to what he called soft despotism, a state of affairs where freedom is gradually eroded not through overt tyranny, but through layers of paternalistic oversight. Today, few institutions better exemplify this danger than the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. Created in the aftermath of the Great Depression, the SEC was supposed to restore faith in the financial system by requiring transparency and accountability from publicly traded companies. And for a time, it did. It required that corporations provide audited financial statements. It cracked down on insider trading. It established important investor protections. In its best moments, the SEC did help clean up the casino. But, like many bureaucracies, over time the SEC began to mutate and metastasize. It grew more entwined with the industry it regulated. The so-called revolving door between the SEC commissioners and Wall Street executives became not an aberration, but a feature. Former SEC chairs went on to lucrative careers at hedge funds and private equity firms. Meanwhile, many Wall Street attorneys and investment bankers were parachuted into senior roles at the SEC, enforcing rules they themselves had previously tried to skirt in many cases. This is not oversight. This is regulatory capture. And that brings us to crypto. In the past decade, Some of the most promising technological innovations in finance have emerged not from traditional banks, but from the cryptocurrency community, the blockchain architects. These technologies are in the process of generating a decentralized, programmable financial layer for the Internet, what many have called the Internet of Value. In this ecosystem, value, money, moves as freely as information does on the World Wide Web, potentially transforming how we transact, how we store wealth, and even how we structure governance. Instead of doing its job to understand and appropriately regulate these technologies, the SEC has often acted simply to stifle them. Notable cryptocurrency companies like Ripple Labs, creators of the XRP ledger, have faced years long lawsuits over whether their tokens constitute unregistered securities, while other tokens with near identical market behaviors have mysteriously escaped scrutiny. Meanwhile, cryptocurrency exchanges like Coinbase have pleaded for regulatory clarity, only to be slapped with enforcement actions in lieu of rules. This isn't just inconsistent, it's downright Kafkaesque. Innovators are told to just come on in and register, only to find that there's no path to registration. They're punished for not following the rules, even as those rules remain unpublished, vague, or contradictory. As the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit put it, the SEC has increasingly acted arbitrarily and capriciously. But why? Why attack the sector so aggressively and so counterproductively? I can only imagine how frustrated I would be if I were one of these companies, but the rest of us have every right to criticize the SEC's behavior. Our tax dollars pay for their reckless litigation, and millions of our fellow citizens suffer terrible financial damages due to that recklessness. What a waste of money! Part of the answer lies in the SEC's own institutional incentives. Bureaucracies, like all systems, are driven by a sense of survival, and nothing guarantees an agency's survival like a high profile villain to pursue. Crypto, complex and easily caricatured, has become that villain. It provides the perfect foil for the SEC to flex its enforcement muscles, issue splashy headlines, and justify ever more expansive authority. But there's another, darker incentive at play: protectionism. Crypto doesn't just challenge regulatory norms, it threatens to displace entire segments of the legacy financial system. From cross border payments to asset custody, from lending to decentralized exchanges, crypto platforms are building alternatives to services currently monopolized by traditional banks and financial institutions. And many of those institutions are deeply embedded in Washington. This raises a fundamental question: is the SEC protecting the public, or protecting incumbents? It's worth pausing here to reflect on how eerily similar this is to other moments in history when bureaucracies resisted transformative technologies. In the late 19th century, the telegraph disrupted traditional postal services. In response, government backed mail services tried to restrict its use. In the 1930s, radio broadcasting threatened print media, and the FCC imposed licensing rules that heavily favored existing outlets. In the early 2000s, peer to peer file sharing challenged intellectual property regimes, prompting lawsuits and legislation that, while aimed at piracy, also curtailed basic digital freedom. In each case, new technologies promised more access, more efficiency, and more individual agency. And in each case, entrenched institutions, often backed by regulators, fought back, not to protect the public, but to protect themselves. Crypto is merely the latest chapter in this long story. Yet, what makes the current moment especially dangerous is the unprecedented scale of power bureaucracies now wield and the utter lack of meaningful oversight. The SEC has used enforcement actions to shape policy in the absence of legislation. That's not how it's supposed to work. Rather than deferring to Congress's authority to establish new rules for a breakthrough technology, the SEC has relied on lawsuits, threats, and backdoor settlements to assert control. This is legislation by litigation, and it's antithetical to the spirit of American innovation. It creates uncertainty for builders. It deters investment. It drives talent offshore. While American regulators bicker and grandstand, jurisdictions like Switzerland, Singapore, the UAE, they're rapidly establishing frameworks that encourage responsible innovation. The U.S. risks losing not only a critical technological race, but a values based one. If decentralized finance can help the unbanked, lower remittance costs, and provide resistance to authoritarian censorship, if cryptocurrency can revolutionize the way people across the globe transact value, shouldn't America lead? Of course, bureaucracies don't change themselves. Accountability must come from the outside, from Congress, from public pressure, from history. Because history tells us something else. When bureaucracies overreach, when they begin to see themselves as sovereign rather than subordinate, when bureaucratic entities weaponize uncertainty to consolidate their power, there is always a breaking point. The Roman Republic devolved into autocracy in large part because its administrative apparatus became so large, so corrupt, and so unaccountable that the public no longer trusted it. The British Empire's colonial bureaucracy was so rigid and extractive that it fueled revolutions from India to America. Even in the modern West, bureaucratic sclerosis has triggered populist uprisings and anti establishment backlashes across Europe and the United States. In other words, we're not exempt from these dynamics, and the stakes are too high to ignore. The challenge now isn't just about the SEC, it's not even just about crypto. It's about whether the American experiment still has the nerve to reinvent itself. At its best, America has never been a country of caution. It's been a country of courage, a place where the future was something to be unleashed, not something to be smothered in red tape. We've grown so accustomed to being cautious and cynical that many of us have forgotten how exhilarating groundbreaking progress can be. Remember lines like, "We choose to go to the moon" by JFK? And we actually did it. It wasn't just political rhetoric. In the middle of the 20th century, we built huge rocket ships that took us to the moon, where we drove around on a moon buggy packed with innovations of its own. Where's that spirit? If only we're willing to let the builders and the doers really rev those engines of ambition again, then I, for one, would be willing to bet that the next generation isn't just going to be better. It's going to be awesome. I'm Brad Harris. So long.